This is part 3 of chapter 8, The Rape of the Mind, the Psychology of Thought, Control, Menticide, and Brainwashing by Mind.wmv. Okay. Continuing along. The trial as an instrument of intimidation. Man's suggestibility can be a severe liability to him and to his democratic freedom in still another important respect. Even when there is no deliberate attempt to manipulate public opinion, the uncontrolled discussion of legal actions such as political or criminal trials in newspaper headlines and in partisan columns helps to create a collective emotional atmosphere. This makes it difficult for those directly involved to maintain their much-needed objectivity and to render a verdict according to facts rather than suggestions and subjective experiences. In addition to any judicial process which receives widespread publicity, exerts mental pressure on the public at large. Thus, not only the participants but the entire citizenry can become emotionally involved in the proceedings. Any trial can be either an act of power or an act of truth. An apparently objective examination may become a weapon of control simply by the action of the suggestions that inevitably accompany it. As an act of power by a totalitarian government, the trial can have frightening consequences. The Moscow Purge trials and the German Reichstag fire are prime examples. We do not, of course, have such horrifying travesties on justice in this country, but our tendency to turn legal actions into a field day for the newspapers, the radio, and television weakens our capacity to arrive at justice and truth. It would be better if we postponed discussion of the merits of any legal case until after the verdict was in. As we have already seen, any man can be harassed into a confession. The cruel process of menticide is not the only way to arrive at this goal. A man can be held guilty merely by accusation, especially when he is too weak to oppose the impact of collective ire and public opinion. In circumstances of abnormal fear and prejudice, men feel the need for a scapegoat more strongly than at other times. Consequently, people can be easily duped by false accusations which satisfy their need to have someone to blame. Victims of lynch mobs in our own country have been thus sacrificed to mass passion, and so have some so-called traitors and collaborators. In public opinion, the trial itself becomes the verdict of guilty. The congressional investigation. Let me first state that I firmly believe that the right of the Congress to investigate and to propose legislation on the basis of such investigation is one of the most important of our democratic safeguards. But like any other human institution, the congressional right to investigate can be abused and misused. The power to investigate may become the power to destroy not only the man under attack, but also the mental integrity of those who in one way or another are witnesses to the investigation. In a subtle way, the current wave of congressional investigations may have a coercive effect on our citizenry. Some dictatorial personalities are obsessed with a morbid need to investigate, and congressional investigations are made to order for them. Everybody who does not agree with them, who does not bow low and submit, is suspect, and is subjected to a flow of vilification and vituperation. The tendency on the part of the public is to disbelieve everything that the demagogue's opponents say and to swallow uncritically the statements made by those who either surrender to his browbeating or to go along with it because they believe in the aims he pretends to stand for. Psychologically, it is important to understand that the simple fact of being interviewed and investigated has a coercive influence. Now read that one more time. Psychologically, it is important to understand that the simple fact of being interviewed and investigated has a coercive influence. As soon as a man is under cross-examination, he may become paralyzed by the procedure and find himself confessing to deeds he never did. In a country where the urge to investigate spreads, suspicion and insecurity grow. Everybody becomes infected with the feelings of the omnipotence of the inquisitor. Wiretapping, for instance, has the same power. It is grasping the secrets of others. In psychological circles, a good deal of attention is now being given to the impact of interviews and interrogations on people. The psychological interviewer himself must be aware of the various interpersonal processes involved in this kind of communication. If he is not, he will not be able to find out where the truth lies. Instead, he will get answers which are implicit in his own questions, answers which have little relation to the real truth. This does not happen only in cases where the interviewer and the man he is interviewing show bad faith. It can happen despite their best intentions, for everybody brings to an interview the sum total of all his earlier interpersonal relationships. In the initial verbal trial and error, during what we could call the smelling out period, each party mobilizes himself to find out what the other party expects and where his weaknesses are, and, at the same time, tries to hide his own weaknesses and emphasize his own strengths. The man in the street who is suddenly interviewed tends to give the answer he thinks his questioner expects. Every conversation, every verbal relationship repeats, at least to some degree, the pattern of the early verbal relationships between the child and its parents. To a man or woman under investigation, the interrogator becomes the parent, good or bad, an object of suspicion or of submission. Since the interrogator himself is often unaware of this unconscious process, the result can be a confusing battle of unconscious or half-conscious tendencies, in which the spoken words are often merely a cover for suspicion-laden conversation between deep layers of both personalities. All people who are systematically interrogated, whether in a court during a congressional inquiry or even when applying for a job or having a medical examination, feel themselves exposed. This very fact in itself provokes peculiar defensive mental attitudes. These attitudes may be useful and protective, but at times they may be harmful to the individual. When a man is looking for a job, for example, he may become overeager, and in his zeal to make a good impression, to put his best foot forward, he may make a bad impression and arouse suspicion. For it is not only what we say, but the way we say it that can indicate our honesty and poise. Nervous sounds, gestures, pauses, moments of silence or stuttering may give us away. Aggressive zeal may seduce us into saying too much. Inhibition may prevent us from saying enough. The defendant in a court action or in an inquiry is defensive not only about the accusations leveled against him or the questions he has to answer, he is even more defensive about his own unconscious guilt and about his doubts about his own capabilities. Many of my colleagues in medicine and psychiatry who have been called as expert witnesses in legal actions have told me that the very moment they were under cross-examination, they felt themselves on trial and nearly convicted. Cross-examination seemed to them often less a way of getting at the truth than a form of emotional coercion, which did a great disservice to both the facts and the truth. This is the reason that every kind of investigative power can so easily become a coercive power. Making witnesses and defendants suffer from acute stage fright can be a nasty weapon of totalitarianism. Both psychologists and psychiatrists appreciate these facts. There is now a strong tendency in these circles to use what we might call a passive technique in interviewing. When the interviewer's questions are not directed toward any specific answer, the man being questioned will be encouraged to answer on his own initiative, out of his own desire to communicate. The neutral question, "What did you do afterwards?" provokes a freer and more honest response than the question, "Did you go home after that?" And that's where I'll stop it. This was part 3 of chapter 8, and we're reading from The Rape of the Mind by Just A.M. Merleau, and I will see you all in the next video.